Thank you for that. Yeah, it's unlikely that I will. One of the sort of advantages of going third in a situation like this is that you can listen to sort of your learned colleagues and pick up on points that they make. And then one of the disadvantages, as you hear them so eruditely make all the points you were going to make, it sort of leaves perhaps a little deja vu when I come to go through some of the things I'm going to discuss. Initially, perhaps I was disappointed. I thought, oh, I was going to say that. But then actually, as I listened, I thought, well, this is actually a demonstrable example of the fact that we are all looking at the same thing in perhaps a not very joined up way. All the issues that we've heard about, the underpinning legislation, the changes in the law or the interpretation of the law about ECHR, Article 2, the issue around context, all of this is extremely familiar to the work of the HET and is something that we've wrestled with. I'll go through where we came from, I think, and we'll sort of work to some of these issues. The HET was set up as a time-limited project by the PSNI and the NIO in February 2005. The fact was it was set up with a budget which was intended to run for 4 years. So that would have taken us to 2009, and the fact that I'm still here is evidence that the project perhaps was underestimated. It was very much perhaps a knee-jerk response is one way of describing what was happening. You have to put yourself back into sort of life in 2004, 2005, when these issues were being discussed. There was a huge optimism, I think, in the initial years after the peace accord that there was going to be a societal response to dealing with the past, that people would all sit down together and sort it all out. I think there was a lot of optimism that perhaps was misplaced, or perhaps was a little early in terms of looking at how these things develop. Post-conflict situations generally take a long time to work through, and perhaps there was a little over-optimism that everything could be sorted quite quickly. In terms of the police response, Hugh Ward was faced with a number of pressures. He was the Chief Constable at the time. It's been mentioned about his statutory obligation to conduct effective investigations and the number of cases involved. And again, once we got into numbers and terminology, that's when our first issues started to arise. A decision was taken to establish a bespoke unit, the Historical Enquiries Team, we decided to call ourselves. And even that is something that, with the benefit of time and hindsight, I would change if I could go back. One of the big issues that's been touched on by Michael earlier is families don't see these as historical investigations, and when you say we're the Historical Enquiries Team, you can quite often get off on the wrong foot for a start. It's not a historical issue for families involved. So the unit was set up. It was decided that we would deal with the historical cases to take the pressure off the relatively new Crime Operations Department of the PSNI. There was no comparable model that's been discussed, certainly in the UK or Europe, where there was any template which we could adopt. And we very much had to sort of sit down and work out what it was we were being asked to do and how we were going to do it. I think that then brought us into another early situation. What was it we were being asked to do? Mention has been made of 1,800 unsolved murders. And in fact, when the HET was announced, the then Secretary of State somewhat inadvisedly said that the unit would look at 1,800 unsolved murders and 300 other deaths. This caused some ructions straight away, because what is it that, why is a death different from one set of families to another? And we quickly sort of moved away from terms like murder and unsolved. These are really police terms. Unsolved means nothing to anybody who isn't a police officer or a person charged with compiling statistics. A case can be recorded as solved if any person who is any party to an investigation is convicted. Thus, we have many offences of murder shown as solved, where getaway drivers were arrested and convicted, where people who provided clean-ups afterwards or safe houses were convicted, accessories were the real perpetrators were never convicted. And then when you got to meet families, and this was in many ways one of our first great benefits, I think, for the HET, was interaction and support from non-government organisations who represented families. And they brought families to see us to say, look, it's all very well you talking police jargon to us, but unsolved, detected, these sort of terms mean nothing to families. The big problem that existed was that most families had little or no information at all about what had happened. Now, as an experienced detective from outside Northern Ireland, I was shocked, and the mention again has been made that, quite correctly, there was no structured family liaison process, probably until around after the Lawrence murder in the MPS, when a whole change came around about how police officers interact in investigations with families. It's true that there wasn't, but there was an unofficial process, and people did update families. Families knew what was happening in investigations because officers in charge used to go and see them and talk to them. Straight away you were into a context situation. We actually asked retired officers from here, how on earth is it that we are meeting families who are saying to us, you are the first police officers we've spoken to for 30 years. Nobody ever told us anything. We didn't know there'd been an inquest. We didn't know that people had been convicted in connection with the murder of my loved one. This is quite a regular occurrence for us, and it's not any particular community. We've had police officer families saying to us, we've never been spoken to by the organisation again since we were notified that he'd been murdered. The issue was a total lack of knowledge. And a meeting with groups like the Retired Police Officers Association, we said, well, how did we get to a situation where people don't know anything? And that is the context issue that's been touched on. Because it was pointed out to us, this is not anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Going to addresses on a regular basis makes us a target, makes other people we're going to see a target. The more information we put out there about how we were investigating offences, the better the opposition got. The opposition was pretty good anyway. And as we've moved through the work that we've done, we've seen the truth of that. The early cases reviewed by the HET, very often deaths arising from street battles and public disturbances. By the time you're into the 1980s, you're looking at professional paramilitary units who had spotters, who had their own surveillance arrangements, who had weapons provided from quartermasters, who had safe houses, clean-up operations, and anti-forensic techniques. Most of this had come about because of convictions of people for offences, and people learn. And in a conflict like took place in Northern Ireland, they learned very, very well because there was an awful lot of examples. Just sort of touching on that, when we set up HET, what were we asked to do and how big was it was one of the questions. Well, there was no record. I'd mentioned the 1800 murders. Well, police had statistics on that. But deaths that weren't recorded as an offence, there was no central record. So we didn't know how big the job was we were being asked to do. At the beginning, before we set up our own database, we were working from the book Lost Lives, which is an excellent publication and very, very useful and helpful. But of course, it also includes deaths outside Northern Ireland, which aren't our remit. But as we've gone through and built up the database, we've now worked through that there are some 3,260 deaths in respect of the Troubles. To break that down, there were 2,294 what you would class as civilians, 303 police officers, and 663 deaths of members of the military. 1,878 deaths were attributed to Republican paramilitaries, 934 to Loyalists, and 354 to the security forces, with 94 unknown attribution. So it's a huge piece of work by any means. Now, if you take that 3,260 deaths, this is in a society where the population is less than the population of Greater Manchester. Now, imagine 3,260 deaths related to a sort of troubles-like situation in Greater Manchester, and you'll see the scale of what this community actually lived through. When we decided, right, well, we're going to have to work through these cases with insights and advice from NGOs, we quickly came to the conclusion that we were going to have to look at all of the deaths. There's no point just saying, well, we won't look at that because it's a solved death, because the families didn't know anything. So it became very early a slightly different project than the one we thought we were setting up. We thought we'd come to do a desktop review of cases, look through case papers, and advise the police service, are there any outstanding investigative opportunities to progress a case? It quickly became apparent to us that there was a much more important objective, that of trying to answer family questions. And again, we went through a number of issues around terminology. When it was first set up, people were talking about closure. Of course, there is no closure for families, even when you do find some answers. Then it became resolution, then a measure of resolution, and now we just say, well, look, we will try and answer family questions, which is an honourable and worthy objective, albeit, as touched upon by both speakers, a very, very difficult place to get to, because sometimes there are no answers, sometimes the answers are not what the family wants to hear, and sometimes the answers completely turn on its axis what a family's always believed. And that is a very, very difficult measure. And one of the issues for us is, while we've been working with families, is to try and avoid re-traumatizing people and bringing really a negative outcome to what we're trying to do by putting them in a worse place than when we set off. So it has been very important to us to work with partners. We could not have got to where we have got, such as it is, without the engagement of a number of NGOs who have never been what you could describe as close allies, but they have been a very, very robust and staunch critical engagement partners, shall we say, in politically correct terms. The point is that they have had the confidence to talk to us and say, listen, you've got that completely wrong, you're not saying enough about this, you're not doing that right. And we have listened, and where we felt appropriate, we have made the changes. If you look at some of the work that we did in the early years of being set up and compare it to where we are now, there is no comparison. We are much wiser because we've been there and learnt it and had some pretty tough experiences along the way. It was clear, I think, that once having expanded the remit of the HET to try and deal with all the cases and to go wider than we'd effectively sort of thought we were going in terms of answering questions, that it was going to be a longer-term piece of work than was first predicated. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing, that's a good thing, but it's a more expensive thing, and it brings you into the realm of politics and finance and budgets and business cases, and it's a consistent problem, really, and each couple of years we have to go back and there is a whole, justify what you're doing. The whole debate kicks off again, certainly within government circles. Well, why are we dealing with the past? Why don't we draw a line? Why don't we move on? And it's an easy debate to have if you are not engaged at any way or level with families that have lived through this. As we are, and as most of the people in the room are, it's about how you move forward effectively. We decided that we would look at all cases on a basis of equality. There would be no judgmental work from us. We would not pass comment on whether people were right or wrong. We would engage with all parties. We've done reports about bombers from paramilitaries, the deaths of soldiers. Families are treated with equal respect, and we do not pass judgment on what was taking place. We inform the facts. Once we were set up, it was quite a difficult project, I suppose, in terms of the fact that we had to try and balance community confidence. We were a British government unit set up by the British government. We were funded by the British government. Nationalist families and groups perhaps looked at us initially and said, well, you're not what we want. And some still don't want us, that's for sure. But then some have engaged, and we are what we are in terms of where we can go. We've tried to structure ourselves into two groups of investigative and review teams. We have some teams that have local staff, and they will deal with cases where there is no objection to former RUC staff being involved. We have other teams that have no local membership, and those teams will do reviews where families have no confidence in anybody connected to the security forces. Even so, that still leaves some questions, some doubt. There are matters that relate to all reviews which can only be handled with the involvement of local or ex-local staff. And here I talk about intelligence. Intelligence is a massive part of all the reviews that we do. And just touching on the issues that were raised about informants and the comments around De Silva, people have often said, why was this such an intelligence-driven conflict? Why was intelligence and special branch such an important part of the conflict here? And again, it goes back to the point I made earlier, the community size. You are dealing with a small selection of people, really. You could probably reference most people in Northern Ireland with a couple of phone calls. Now, police tactics involve a number of things. You can have preventative policing, which is high-profile policing to put out and to deflect crime from an area or to prevent crime by having a car parked outside a bank. Preventative policing, high-profile policing. You can have undercover work where you have officers engaged as infiltrators of organisations. You have intelligence where you use informants. You can have technical capabilities where you can use eavesdropping, technical devices to listen to conversations and disrupt plans. All this is very great, but not much of it works in Northern Ireland. You can't do effective surveillance in Northern Ireland. If you wanted to try and do a surveillance on somebody in South Armagh, you'd last about 2 minutes because everybody knows everybody. You can't use undercover officers. As I say, a couple of phone calls and anybody can be referenced. So those two options are out. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, the technical capabilities that existed were not great. So that wasn't really an option either. So essentially, if you have a look at the context of the situation, the policing response was sort of gathered into two areas. Firstly, you had high-profile preventative policing, and there you had your army roadblocks and your police roadblocks and search operations and arrests, preventative policing. Then you had intelligence, and a huge amount of resources and time were focused on developing intelligence and agents because it was the only effective investigative tool in a high percentage of the cases. So that is why it is a disproportionate area of the business that we look at. Because of...
Your
Righto, I'll rush to the end, which actually says how well we're doing. Just really, in terms of where we are, we have this issue that's been touched on again, the fact that there aren't that many positive outcomes from what we do. Well, I think it depends on what you say is positive. Now, in terms of arrests and charges, we've referred over 40 cases recently to the PSNI. There is some evidence out there, but the evidential standard, once we've passed it on, then has to be met, and the Attorney General touched on how difficult that can be. But it's about, for us, trying to explain to families what the barriers are. Now, families will often say to us, well, what about DNA? What about fingerprint advances? And people have looked at CSI and all those programs, and it's great, you stuff the bit of evidence in one and the driving license picture comes out the other end. It doesn't actually work like that, and you have to sort of explain that to people. And have you noticed how the bandits are always in when they go around? I don't know how that works. It's never happened. So you have to sort of say to people, yes, there is DNA, but is it applicable in the circumstances? We've touched on integrity of evidence with the Attorney General and the difficulty of time. So it's about expectations. It's about managing expectations. The HET is committed and remains committed to working with families and their representatives to try and answer questions. It's about the best we can do. It's not enough for everybody. It doesn't suit everybody, but it's better than nothing. Thank you.
Thank you.